This is Vinicio Cinta, and this is an interview for the Voces Oral History Project. Today is January 14, 2017, and I'm here with Mr. Henry Mendoza in Marina del Rey, California. Mr. Mendoza, thank you so much for granting us this interview.
Not at all. My pleasure.
And we'll start talking first about your career. So, why did you get into journalism?
I don't know. No. As I look back, when I was in third grade, a teacher appointed me this editor of the school paper. I didn't like that. I was surprised. I wanted to be the sports writer. But I've always had an interest in knowing what's going on, wherever. And when I left high school, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. My father wanted me to be a lawyer. But I found the study of the law kind of, I didn't enjoy it. And I kind of fell into a newspaper job. Somebody saw that I was around who had judged my work in high school. And I went to work on a part-time basis at the Riverside Press Enterprise, which was a very good newspaper in those days. I loved it. And for the first time it occurred to me, you should have fun and love what you're doing. I stayed with it the rest of my career.
So was that before you went to college?
That was as I was going to college. That kind of directed me for a lot of reasons. And I wound up at Cal State Fullerton, where I got my degree in communications.
So what were you covering for the Riverside newspaper?
I first started, ironically, back in sports. I got a great job. I had a great opportunity. I was taken care of very well. So I got, even as a college student on a part-time basis, I covered the Dodgers, the LA Rams, on occasion. So I got some great opportunities. Auto racing was a big part of it too. And I liked it. I liked it a lot. So I stayed with it. They asked me to find a school, in fact, that where I could get my degree and keep working. So I drove to Fullerton from there and got my degree and kept working. It was my first job at the Press Enterprise.
Why did you choose Fullerton?
Because it was the closest with what I thought was a good program. And I knew actually somebody else I had written for had seen my stuff. And it just seemed like the obvious choice. I got a great opportunity in education there, so I really enjoyed it.
So before starting your work at the Riverside newspaper, did you follow any particular publications? Were you an active news reader?
I used to read I read the LA Times and the San Bernardino Sun, both as long as I could read. Usually starting in sports, but eventually growing out into other fields and the rest of the paper.
So in your first job, how diverse was the newsroom?
Not very. In fact, when I was at the Press Enterprise, working sports on a part-time basis and going to college, I met somebody who turned out to be a long-time and great friend, Frank Delomo. He was there as an intern. That's really the only place he ever did any work outside of the LA Times. And Frank and I became friends. That was a long time ago, before you were born. Probably before your parents were born. 1967.
So besides you and Mr. Delomo, were there any other Latinos in the newsroom?
I can't remember any. There might have been one or two, but no, not that I could remember.
And And in these in early years of your career and while you were going to college, who would you say were your role models in journalism?
I got to say Frank. Frank was kind of ahead of me on the career ladder. Also, I knew about Ruben Salazar. Those two in the early years.
What did you admire about their work? What would be the particular things you...
Especially Ruben. What I admired about his work was that he was willing to speak up when necessary. And he did. And as a result, a lot of us knew about that and the issues that came up from time to time.
So were you talking about speaking up, in a time of a lot of civil rights activism, were you critical or how did you see the work of the mainstream media in covering, for example, Mexican American community?
It started for me in a strange way because my parents taught me and suggested that I should know how to relate to all communities. So I tried, and it wasn't that I was denying my background, but I just tried to get along with everybody and be a part of everything. The first time I wrote a news story at the Press Enterprise, when I moved out of sports and moved into news, there was a phone call from, I don't know who they were, but it was a couple in Casablanca, which was an important and volatile barrio in Riverside. And they wanted to talk to me. And I was called over to another part of the newsroom, and I answered questions from them. They wanted to know who I was, where I came from, and they wanted to know if I spoke Spanish. And I told them I did, and I answered all the questions. And I was kind of taken aback, and I said, "Why are you asking?" And they said to me, "I still remember that, because that's the first name we've seen in the paper that we identify with. And we want to know who you are, and we're going to follow your work." I'll never forget that, obviously. And it tugged at me. And it made me realize what I've said all the time. I didn't walk into this newsroom or this profession waving a flag of any kind. But it made me understand what the need for diversity was. And it made me understand why I should recognize that community. And that's been part of my career because of that couple, whoever they were.
So you mentioned Casablanca. So you mentioned that it was, you mentioned volatile. So what was going on at that time in Riverside?
You name it. Riverside was a great place for a lot of reasons. And Casablanca was the barrio. And it was one of the barrios. And it was right along the railroad tracks, so there's a lot of things that went on in Riverside. There was gangs, barrio schools, education was an issue. People were kind of raising the education issues they faced. Language, segregation, and integration was a big deal. Ironically, a few years later, in fact, my college, at the end of my college stop at UC Riverside, I had a lot of stops. The Riverside School District, this is way before anybody else, quietly decided to integrate the schools. And what they did was they started busing students of all creeds, races, ethnicities around the school district. And their idea was to try and approximate the numbers of the whole city. Their theory was kids don't know to be bigoted. So try to expose them to each other. Dr. Jane Mercer, who was a sociologist there at UC Riverside, and a couple of other professors thought, what a great opportunity. So they started a thing called the Riverside School Study, which was a pioneer in the fields of sociology and related fields. And I worked for them. We interviewed families, thousands of families throughout the city, and asked them, because this was integrating all the schools. Well, so if they did it right, and that was their intention, if you talk to the kids and parents and kids in early elementary, get their attitudes. What do you think of? And then fill in the blanks. It was a long interview. But they also needed to interview in Spanish because there was a lot of people who weren't necessarily very fluent in English. So that's where I came in. I did a lot of interviews in Spanish. And their idea was to follow these thousands of families for years and try and see how their attitudes went and changed. So I was part of that. Great training. I think they went for 6 or 8 years and the funding died out. But there was still some ingenious revelations that came out in trying to get the attitudes of people and kids.
Do you recall anything in particular that was that you were?
You know what I remember about that was that, and this is talks about the way households open or don't. The Anglo households I did. Come in, have coffee, water. Would you know? Some of them didn't even like the idea or weren't sure, but they were very hospitable. The Mexican families were not. They weren't. They just didn't open up their homes and weren't used to having people from outside come in. It was a very interesting facet of what I found in the community. Beyond that, it was really pretty the same stuff. A lot of ignorance, and I don't mean that negatively. They just didn't know. They hadn't been exposed to different groups, which was pretty interesting for me because my background, my school, Wilson School in Colton, one of 6 schools in the city, and the only one that was 99% Latino, Mexican. All the other ones were less mixed and mostly Anglo. So, accident?
How was Colton?
It was very interesting. What I would call the barrio was kind of cut off by railroad tracks. We were segmented because of the railroad. I was raised, my first home in Colton when I was 4, I think we moved there, was half a block from 4 or 5 railroad tracks, and they would do switching there. You can imagine, it was like an earthquake sometimes. We'd get 100 cars, freight train cars, and it was big noise and tumultuous. And then on the other end, about 3 blocks up the other end, there was a cement plant, and they would use dynamite. My grandfather worked there most of his life, and it was tumultuous because you get a lot of different. So Colton was, in its own way, not angrily but unintentionally segregated or intentionally segregated. I do know there was on the hill in one end of the town near the river, Santa Ana River, which was dry then, a community up on the hill called Grand Terrace. And when I was a kid, and I grew up a little bit, my father had a friend who was in real estate. And every once in a while, because my father was pretty well known in town, they'd go up to look at the homes in Grand Terrace. And the buzz would start. Are they going to move here? Because they didn't like Mexican people living up there. About 15 years later, I bought a home there. Not intentionally, but I wasn't, well, it just kind of happened. It was a good place to live. Things had changed by then.
So, in the late 60s, when you were getting started in the field, there was a lot of organizing, a lot of activism. were you ever interested, or did it pull you at some point? Were you politicized at any point?
To a degree. I was politicized to the point that I wanted to make sure. One of my great moments was having Cesar Chavez visit our newspaper. And I made sure he got an interview with the publisher and the editor. So I wanted to make sure the stories got out, and the stories were covered fairly and accurately and completely. I guess I'm more aware than active, because as a journalist, there's a line there that is important to be drawn, and I did. But I also made sure, and one of my tenets was a lot of the people in the community would want you to get involved, and I said, look, here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I'm going to get involved, and I would make sure they knew how the newsrooms operated, because there was only one or two or three of at the most in most of these newsrooms. So I would introduce them to the feature editor, to the business editor, and I'd make sure they knew where to go to get their story in the paper. And I think that was how I served, to make sure that the stories got out.
Like giving access? Like
Absolutely. Providing access, introduction, and then I'd say, if you have any problems, call me. Ideally, there'd be no calls, every once in a while. But I thought fairness was important. I mean, I remember the political editor got upset with me one time because there was a Hispanic candidate, Latino candidate for city council. And he was running stories on all the candidates. And the story for the Latino was okay, but kind of short. And another story the day before was like 3 times as long. I pointed that out. I said, you got to, maybe it should be shorter, but I don't know. I know that it's not as comprehensive. So that's how I tried to make sure there was balance and fairness.
You mentioned that Cesar Chavez visited the newspaper. You said you wanted to make sure he was interviewed by the publisher. So what did you do?
I greeted him, took him into the editor's office, and I said, here's Cesar Chavez. I remember he had two large bodyguards with him, because his status in life was under scrutiny, if not threats. They fell asleep in the chairs next to us. But I made sure he was able to get his message to the editor. And that kind of thing is the thing I made sure. And then I did a story on what was going on. But I was a conduit.
Okay. Also, the other thing, I mean, you were helping connect people with the newspaper. Was there any pressure? I mean, there was that one call you mentioned, but was there any pressure of people trying to say, well, the newspaper or you personally should do more to...
Always. There was always a call for more. And to the degree that I could, what I tried to do is make sure they understood, for example, what Mexican Independence Day was and what Cinco de Mayo really represented. And when there were events or political movements in town, try to make sure everybody understood what that was all about, because it wasn't always. And the people were all constantly wanting to be sure they were well represented. And it was early. That was in the 60s and 70s when things were getting started.
What can you tell us about? So Mr. Frank Del Olmo was there at the same time.
I met him at the Riverside Press Enterprise.
So was he?
He was an intern, and I guess to be honest, all we know is that's where we met. I'm not sure if he had finished college or not, but I know he was already connected to the LA Times, and I think he had been an intern there too. And that's where he wound up working and developing a very great career.
Well, when he was there at the Riverside, did he have like a similar? Do you recall if he was?
You know, we didn't talk that much about. We weren't in a position, and he was commuting a lot to L.A. But I know he was very well received there and very well respected. And we, in fact, I forgot. He and I were both considered for the paper wanted to do a story. The Press Enterprise wanted to do a story on the life of agricultural workers in Riverside County and what it was like to be out in the fields. And it was he or I or both of us. And Frank wound up doing this, going out there, spending some time in the fields. Because I was in sports, so it was a big deal to get me out. So it wasn't easy. But Frank, that's one of the stories he did.
Going back, while you were going to Fullerton, so how was journalism education back then? Was there what was the visibility, for example, of Chicanos?
Not at all. The closest to visibility for Latinos or Chicanos at the time was the formation of groups, the influence that the appearance of groups like the Brown Berets in those days, all of a sudden there was a recognition that, wow, there's some other people here. But it wasn't that significant. It wasn't big. And I say it wasn't significant in that it wasn't so far reaching, but it was there. And the identifications, that's part of why CCNMA was born, Chicano News Media Association, was because, well, I'll tell you more as we progress.
So CCNMA got started in the early 70s?
That would have been, what did I say, 78? I don't remember. 80, yeah, it would have been the 70, would have been the early 70s, 74, 75.
Okay, in the mid-70s.
Mid-70s. As I later found out when I got to LA and started spending more time with Felix and Frank, there was a group of Latinos in journalism. Frank Del Olmo. Felix Gutierrez was already doing some newspaper work, but mostly heading towards education. Henry Alfaro, Frank Cruz, Joel. I can't remember Joel's. He gets credit for being the biggest instigator of Chicano News Media. I can't remember his last name.
What was the first name? I'm sorry.
Joel. They and a few others, a photographer. I don't remember his name. Chapo. That's what he used to be called. Because he was in all the coverage and he used to get around a lot. A handful of Frank Sotomayor was when they would get together, and they would often, and this is the way they described it. After a week or a day, depending on the events or whatever, they'd get together and get a 6-pack of beers at a house and sit and talk about this and that and all the things, all the issues that came up that they thought were important. Maybe not being covered enough, whatever. And then it occurred, thanks to Joel, oh God, I can't remember his last name. I never met him because then he died before they got too far along. They used to share stories. And it occurred to them, maybe we should try and organize or do something. And that's when the group got together and got loosely organized. You know, they put in $20 a year or something and pay dues, and that's when the group got together and came up. I hate to say it, but their first name was the California Chicano Newsmen's Association. Well, one of the people involved in news was Estela Lopez in those days, and Estela, can you change that? And a few years later, they changed it to News Media Association. And that's when they put their proposal together that I saw at the San Bernardino paper. And that's the proposal that that we funded, that Gannett funded. I don't remember the figures. I think they asked for $15,000, and they asked me what I thought of it, and I said, I think it's a great idea. Because Gannett, you have to understand, Gannett owned 35 newspapers all over the country. One in Reno, one in San Bernardino. Everything else was across the Mississippi and the East Coast. So they weren't out here. But when the proposal came up, and I said, 15,000, that's not enough. They had to ask for more money. I don't remember what the numbers were. Gannett gave them 25,000 to get things going and fund an executive director. Andrea Cano was the first, and get things rolling. And from then, every year, Gannett was, for a long time, Gannett was. And Jerry Sass from Gannett, when he found out about it, he worked for the Gannett Foundation. He was, I'll never forget Jerry being at our meetings, and we used to meet at La Fonda. And every time we had a meeting, because we had all these TV people too, the mariachi would come over off stage and play amongst us. And Jerry loved it. His eyes would, I think he's still around in Arizona. And Jerry used to love to hear the mariachi. He never stopped smiling with the mariachi groups. He loved being in the middle of that. And Jerry kept supporting us. He'd make us toe the line and make sure we knew what we were doing, but Jerry kept supporting us.
So taking a step back, so before this proposal was handed to you, were you in touch? Were you a part of that group?
No, I was in San Bernardino. San Bernardino is only 55 miles away. Might as well be another light year. I mean, because in those days especially, the freeway wasn't even done. So in those days, it was a long way away. I knew about him, and once in a while, we didn't have email, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have the communication system that we have now. A long time ago. But I remember Frank.
So it sounds like Gannett was very supportive of
Big time. Big time. Big time.
So was that also noticeable in how they ran the newspaper you worked in?
Well, they were sensitive. They were open. They would listen. And no matter how much diversity they recognized, it's hard. And if there's only one of me or two of me, and there weren't many Latinos, it's even harder. So, yeah, they were open to it, but it was still different.
So, how long were you in this first newspaper?
Well, San Bernardino and Riverside are right next to each other. I started at the Riverside paper, then I moved to the San Bernardino paper. They had some agreements about competing with each other, even though they were 10 miles away. So they both grew to pretty mid-size at that point. So I went from from Riverside to San Bernardino. So I was in the Inland Empire. It's called the Inland Empire. I was there until, wow. Oh yeah, I opened the ABC bureau there for Channel 7. So it was the mid-70s, late 70s, 77, 78.
So can you tell us more about that particular job, opening the bureau over there?
Well, I opened the bureau. That was, it was a strange experience. Again, that distance that I'm talking about was different then. There was darkness, a lot of space between LA and San Bernardino and the Inland Empire in those days. The growth hadn't covered that territory in between. So I opened the Riverside Bureau for ABC, KABC. And we only had the limited expectations they had from us, a couple of stories a day, just didn't satisfy me. A good friend of mine, or a guy who I had met in an interview with the Washington Post, Bob Maynard, was the first black editor of a major newspaper in the country. He was named the editor of the Oakland Tribune. I forgot about it. And Bob was, if you see the movie All the President's Men, he was the one black face in the Washington Post in that experience. But I knew him, and he had come out to my house, that house that I told you about that I bought in Grand Terrace. It used to be segregated. Bob was there for a party after a journalism day we had at University of Redlands. We became friends. And then, so when he got named editor of the Oakland Tribune, it was a really surprise. Gannett kind of gave him that paper to be editor. And then he wound up buying it, but the paper was having trouble. It was the end of an era. So when Bob was named editor, I sent him a cactus. And I told him to put it on his desk so he could remember the other minority. And he hired me. And I went to work. I left Channel 7 after 6 months. I was doing hardly anything. There was just nothing going on. So I went to work for Bob at the Oakland Tribune. And I had a great experience there.
What were you covering over there?
I was the assistant national editor. And we were segueing the paper from the daily afternoon paper it used to be, and that's at the end of afternoon papers, into a morning paper. And it was a big deal. In the context of that moment in history of the Bay Area, it was a big deal. So it was fun. I worked with some great people, got to meet Al Newharth, who was the Gannett Company CEO. And it was a lot of work. But I also helped redesign the paper, a new style. I mean, we just did a new style book, a lot of changes to the paper, and kind of brought it up to date. It was an interesting experience.
How long were you at?
I was only there about 8 months. Because the week that I got there, I remember I hadn't even unpacked, and the LA Times offered me a job. And I said, hey, why now? I've been trying to get to the LA Times for years, and this is the worst possible time. So I put them off for a while, and it was left open. Come whenever you want, come for the weekend, come visit Frank. So I did. Interestingly, when I was offered a job by the LA Times, they offered me more money than Frank DeLolmo was making. And I told Frank, I said, here's what they're offering. He says, We were good friends. He used that to leverage himself a raise. So that was part of the diversity too, getting an opportunity and being open and frank with your friends and colleagues, so that everybody gets recognized. It was a great lesson for me, and for Frank.
Actually, that now that you bring that issue up about openness and its relation to diversity, how were there any trends in how duties were assigned? Were there any differences?
Oh yeah, and we used to battle that. Frank and I and others. We used to talk about the taco beat.
How would you describe that taco beat?
Any story that had to do with Hispanics. You know about it? And if you don't, how come you don't? Well, LA is a big city. I know a lot, and I was born there, but that doesn't mean I know everything going on, even then, in the Latino community. So that's one of the stories that they used to talk about over the beers, and talking about aftermath. What, the taco beat, Well, Well, it's not possible. And that just because I don't know something doesn't mean I'm not, I can do other things. So yeah, assignments used to be, and they learned the hard way sometimes. An old high school competitor and friend of mine was the city editor one day when a fire broke out in Las Vegas. And I was on my way there for the weekend anyway. And we kept monitoring it. And he said, you better go. So I went with a photographer, 2 photographers and me. No, 2 reporters and me. We went to the Valley fire, first big fire in Vegas. And I was going to go there anyway for the weekend, so it worked out very well. But I started calling in stuff to the writers. I was in the field, and we had it was a big fire, national story. And they kept saying, where'd you get this? You're getting stuff nobody else has. Are you sure they said that? I said, yeah. And afterwards, I figured out, and they figured out, Bally's was the only hotel in those days to have an office in Mexico City. They had 800 Mexicans there celebrating a holiday on a trip, as a group. Well, I found all these people speaking Spanish. I was the only Latino reporter there. So I got a lot of quotes nobody else got. A lot of stories nobody else got. I didn't know that. I knew everybody thought I was a great reporter. When I came back, and I got a few days off, but how do you find out? Oh, that's diversity. That's what diversity is all about. Knowing the other language, knowing another language, any other language. I was lucky. Now it would be different. And that's why when you hear like 9/11, and nobody in the state, or very few people in the State Department knew how to speak the language of some of these culprits, that's diversity. And now the whole world is got to be diverse. It's all here. It's all everywhere. It's all communicating. So I learned about diversity by covering the Bally's fire. And so did the people back at how did you get that? People talking Spanish. I understood.
So did that change anything in how
Absolutely. Absolutely. It changes everything. Change, because you never know what's going to be out there. And the editor never knew, the city editor never knew what I was going to find when I was out on a story. There was a lot of stories. The first day I was at the LA Times, that happened when there was a killing in one of the projects. So, yeah.
So did the leadership at the newsroom become more conscious or more
aware?
Aware.
They better understood what diversity was all about. And fortunately, they figured, well, sometimes women were involved too. Maybe women will talk. Who's the subject? Who are you talking to? Would they talk better to a man or a woman? Yeah. More open? Yeah. It's been when it hits, you almost sometimes see their eyes widen. Oh, that's what that works. A little, it's not as pronounced now as it used to be, but it used to be. You could tell.
Was there any, were there any instances in which maybe this, I mean, you mentioned the taco pit, right? Where it could be, like a negative, like a pigeonholing,
It could be because they'd send you out on stories they weren't sure about and they didn't understand it. So you go find out. And then you got to come back and kind of explain and sell it. It would also be the guy that was responsible for hiring Frank and hiring me. He's gone now. Mark Murphy. He was the Metro editor at the LA Times. And Mark was a great man. Sensitive man. And he kind of got, he got it when you talk about diversity. He also liked, per capita, I think he hired more Latinos than any editor I've ever seen. And he used to like to, he would spread the word. He'd tell Frank, and Frank would tell me, and let's have lunch. And we had introduced him to a restaurant in East LA, La Parrilla. And he said, let's go to La Parrilla. And at first we didn't get it. He said, well, where's Robert? Where's George? Can we get David Reyes? And he started naming all the, and we'd figure out ways to get them in, because David Reyes was in San Diego. Robert was in San Diego. We had people all over, but so we'd go to lunch together. We'd have enjoyable lunches with him and a woman who turned his wife. And we came in one day after lunch, and it was a long lunch, and we were all, this is a different era. We were all identified as we came in with the boss into the back door of the newsroom. And everybody noticed, because they'd seen we weren't there, and now they noticed we came in with the boss. And I'll never forget this. We walked in, and somebody said, oh, here comes, what did he say? Oh, Pancho Villa and the gang. And I didn't think anything of it. There was a young woman who later became a photographer, and then I think she worked at the New York Times, a Latina. She came to us in tears at the back of the room when I went to my desk. She said, how can you take that? I said, what? Well, they called you Pancho Villa. And I didn't take it negatively, but she did. She didn't like that. And it occurred to me, you got to be careful about things like that. Because although I don't think they meant anything, they were singling us out. And later we found out there were people singling us out, not always for good reasons. So in that respect, we became more sensitive to the taco beat and what all that represents.
So at that point that you were in LA, were you now participating with what became CCNMA? Well, was it already established?
Yeah, oh yeah.
It was already established.
Yeah, and we had offices and everything.
So you became a member when you got to that?
Oh, no, I had been a member, but I just wasn't at the meetings all the time. I wasn't around. We had more people here, Latinos here than. When I moved from the LA Times to, I moved back to Channel 7. And there was a period during which I was kind of between the jobs. I had a week off, maybe two, I don't know. And there was an incident downtown where federal authorities discriminated against one of our photographers. The guy was trying to remember, Chapo. They said, you don't belong here. Well, why not? Because he's Latino? He had a camera like everybody else. So we protested. We made a point to raise it, and we had a news conference. And I was the spokesperson at the news conference because I was between jobs, and it wasn't a violation of. So I explained it to everybody. But yeah, we started to take a more assertive position when some of our members, he was a member, he was a lifetime, he was one of the early members, when we got grief from authorities. And it would happen from time to time.
So you said there was a press conference. You mentioned, did you say the word protest? So what? How?
We just registered that we noticed that it was wrong, that he didn't deserve to be singled out. It was just a statement. But in those days, because we had so many people like Cruz, like me, that were identified in the media, people listened. We had it at the press club, the old press club on Vermont. So they listened, and it was a story.
What what was the agenda, the programs that CCNMA was pursuing at that time?
We had, in fact, we had several things that we did. We gave scholarship. The first thing we did is scholarships to students. We've given a lot of money historically to students. That's always been the first priority. The whole idea was we need more. How are we going to get more? Send them to college. So that was our first priority. In fact, it was a big step to go beyond that. Well, what else can you do? Well, we didn't want to be accused of waving flags and being too far out there. But we also wanted to recognize things like discrimination against the photographer. So we stepped up and started to do it. And then we developed a thing called, I don't know if anybody else had done it. It's kind of routine now, called a job fair. And actually, we called it the Journalism Education Program, where we would, for a weekend, invite recruiters from media all over the country to a location, USC, UCLA, downtown, whatever, hotels, and have a conference. And we called it the Journalism Opportunities Conference. And the idea was we would schedule, if we had 50, and there were days that we had 50, 60. That's kind of died out, sadly. But for the Journalism Opportunities Conference, we would schedule students with recruiters. And at first, the whole idea was, well, here's a student. You think we don't have any? Well, we'd show them students. Let them see the recruiters. Talk to the recruiters. We'd schedule them. And it was before computers, so it was a little difficult. But the idea was to make sure that they saw your face. And then we expanded it. It used to be juniors and seniors. Then we just said anybody could come. And the idea was so that you're a face that they recognize. And year after year after year, the recruiters, that's how I connected with the Washington Post. But even I was a professional. If you wanted to, students or professionals, you want to move on, move up, move over. So that was one of the best things we ever did, Journalism Opportunities Conference. And that would expose our people, whether it was students or professionals or young professionals, because this is a big market. There's all sorts of strata to recruit. I was recruited by the Post. I got a tryout with the Post from that. They didn't select me and said I wasn't ready. And a few years later, they came back and said, "You want to come now?" No, not now. I'm fine. So I know it worked. I met some people. That's how I met Bob. So that was kind of the second facet: education and recruitment and placement. So we've always tried to be. And the other thing was informal. There's some people there that give me credit who are very well known in the media for getting them exposed, giving them opportunity. That's all we tried to do. Walk them into a newsroom and introduce them to the boss, just like I did in the stories. Same thing.
So journalism, of course, there's print, there's broadcast. So how did that work for the organization? Were there any, I don't want to say factions, but were there any divisions? Maybe people who work in Spanish versus language media.
That was an issue for a while. Spanish language media, and I talk about it a lot because I think it's a consideration. And one of the things that's important to understand is that, and no longer, it's different. It's changed in my career. It used to be Spanish language media was so small, it was hard to. It was just different level. At the same time, it's grown. Univision, arguably at a given moment, can be the strongest media outlet in the country, especially LA right now. So they like to show their ratings and say, look, and they're right. It depends on what you're measuring, and ratings are always not appropriately designated. But Yeah, the language. In fact, Rafael Prieto, who's now in North Carolina, I think. Rafael was a reporter and columnist for La Opinión. And Rafael and I put together uh, the first, I believe, multimedia multilingual conference at UCLA when I was, a long time ago. And Rafael was proud. He designed the logo, and we had a full day of stuff to integrate the languages, because the the basics are the same. So yeah, it was an issue. It's less of an issue now, just like languages and ethnicities are less of an issue now, but it's still factors.
So was this conference a CCNMA event or
Yep,
was it?
yep, yep. It was a CCNMA event.
And that kind of leads me also to ask many people who worked and who work now in Spanish language media are journalists from Latin American countries. Some of them were trained over there.
Yep,
Was there an issue?
never an issue. We understand the difference. I mean, I don't think it was an issue. We understood from early on that different qualifications, different necessities, different issues. When when you're being licensed in a country and observed, then it's different issues come up. So you treat the media, you treat the events a little differently. And many of us, I know I was in Mexico a lot for, I did a series and I did petroleum explosion in San Juanico. You learn the way you're treated there. And it just happens. So issue, no. Recognize difference, yes. And different needs as a result. But I got to say that my experience has been Spanish language media has done a great job of catching up and getting rid of those. I mean, uh, we're not good friends, but I met him a long time ago, Jorge Ramos. He's become a great spokesman, as it should be. That's what we need more. And he's been a great spokesman for the diversity issues. I mean, you saw what he did. He challenged Trump. So, yeah, I think they've stepped up very well.
Another thing, CCNMA at some point started having local chapters, right?
Um, that was later. Um, yeah, when I guess I don't remember. I've been president and I've been executive director. And I think when I was president, I encouraged, yeah, we started having local chapters. And that was like in I want to say the early 80s. And my thought there was everything that went on in Los Angeles, it would be great if it mattered because we started to have a lot of people, more in Riverside, in San Bernardino, in Palm Springs, or in San Diego or in San Jose. So yeah, we had enough people that we had local chapters.
So did it at any point? So it was a statewide organization.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sacramento, we had a Sacramento chapter that was very active. Um, that was in the early 90s. But that was also a function of when there was more of us in different places. And there was more. There were more.
And what about I don't know if a working relationship or collaboration with groups like NABJ or other other groups of Latino journalists elsewhere in the U.S.
It needs to be recorded that NABJ formed from California Chicano News Media Association bylaws. They asked us for a copy of the bylaws, which we shared, and they formed when they got them. And the subsequent groups were all born from California Chicano Association, News Media Association bylaws, and and then obviously our what we started to do, whether it was chapters. They were always invited to journalism opportunities conferences. We were a pioneer.
So the bylaws drafted by CCNMA became the template for.
Absolutely. Absolutely became the template for many other groups.
Okay, so there was collaboration from the very start. Was there a working relationship, like joint events or programs?
Yeah, yeah. And we brought them into the JOC's, Journalism Opportunities Conference, all the time. Yes, absolutely.
And what about other local or city-based Latin organizations, maybe in Texas or Florida? Was there any link to that?
There was recognition. One of the things that was difficult, and we can segue to NAHJ, one of the issues was the First Amendment and the notion of journalists being independent is a difference from being a Hispanic public relations person. And we recognize that. We intentionally delayed formation of NAHJ because we wanted to make sure. I was president of CCNMA when the idea at a journalism opportunities conference first surfaced. Well, why can't we join? Well, because you're a PR guy. And that's what a lot of my memory is. A lot of people in PR from Texas had come here because JOC was getting bigger, and they were here for a lot of reasons. But they wanted to know, well, can't we join? Yeah, you can, but you don't get to vote. Sorry, that's just how we are. And we were very, very careful about that. That was a big battle. In fact, I would say that we delayed NHJ a year because we weren't ready to deal with that issue. I got to interject here. As I said before, Frank Del Olmo was the senior editorial guy in the country. So when they came to CCNMA and talked about, he was also pretty high on the mass at the LA Times. He was also very guarded about forming a national group that included Beyond News Media and wanted to be careful. And he was busy. So he asked me, I want you to take a role in leading the formation of NHJ. I'll do whatever I need to do to help you and to support you and make sure Times Mirror is part of that. But I don't want to be out front. I said, sure. That's part of why I stepped forward and stayed involved. There was a small dispute about, well, if I wasn't president, why should I? Well, it's because it's me. It wasn't. And I was stubborn and steadfast. I wanted to stay involved because I was telling Frank everything that was going on. And he was kind of the guru, if you will, and a good friend. And I trusted him and he trusted me. So I would tell Frank everything that was going on, and then he'd guide or make sure that we got, because he had tentacles and connections all over the country. So he was able to help us a lot more than people realized.
So these delays in creating the national.
A little bit.
So were they? So the main reason for this was the professional side. So
News media.
News.
We had at one of the Journalism Opportunities conferences, I think it was a Friday night. I was by then spending time on the west side of LA in a different part of town. And I had a restaurant friend, location owner. I said, can we, I don't know, we had 20 people. And I'll never forget that night because there was people ready to pay dues. I said, fine, but you can't, you want to join CCNMA, you're not going to. See, we had nonprofit status. You're not going to get to vote. So that's how it was a delaying tactic. And as it turned out, it was necessary because there was, we had Puerto Ricans in New York telling us, who are we? I remember, I can't remember his name. He was a former light heavyweight champion of the world, Torres. Jose Torres, I think. He went to our meeting in New York. We wound up having meetings all over the country, and that's why it took 2 years. He had a nickname. I don't know it. But he had a column in New York. He was a journalist too. Nice man, smart man. But this is a former light heavyweight champion of the world. And he's standing at our forum, and he's telling me, "Why are you here? We don't care about you." And the point was, they were raising, and he was raising points that weren't issues, but it was all, I hate to put it, kind of the whole notion of, that was the East Coast gang. So who are we from California? And in those days, we were even less considered, right? So from the Journalism Opportunities Conference that year, and I'm sure Frank might have told you about it. Frank was the executive director at the time, and I'm president. We just had to slow down. But the good thing is, Jerry Sass was willing and interested in funding us. So I think we got $100,000 for a year, and twice, so that we spent 2 years forming. We went to Florida, we went to New York, we went to Texas, Chicago, all over.
So this conference that you were mentioning was the one in San Diego in 1982? Or is that a separate?
No, that was later.
Okay. So
yeah.
First it was a Journalism Opportunities Conference.
Here.
From
and that bred the San Diego meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what year was this JOC?
I don't remember. Frank can tell you. Newton can tell you. The JOC led to San Diego, which led to the national formation. That took 2 or 3 years altogether. But the San Diego meeting was the first gathering. If more conservative people had known, they might have fought us. But it was a great meeting. I have a personal friend who met his wife there. All sorts of stuff. But it was a great meeting. It was a great meeting.
So why would a more conservative...
No, people don't want Latinos to get together. They would have thought, whoa. They had no idea what was going on.
So the major conference, which was national now, so did that help bring together people from places that were more disconnected?
Oh, yeah. At the peak, NAHJ was, I don't know what the numbers were. Somebody could tell you from NAHJ. But I'm guessing probably had 2,000, maybe 3,000 members. And this is where I kind of parted ways, because I thought what NAHJ could do most importantly was create centers all over the country. And that's where I thought the notion of chapters, because we'd already been through it, was more important. Others thought, we got to be in Washington and have a voice. For what? We don't expect special treatment. Have a voice for what? And the other thing, it was important, we never were able to get the attention of HR all over the country. They didn't hire in the numbers we should have had. And that's been a big disappointment, that we weren't a better vehicle for getting people hired. For me.
So, if you don't mind, I'll
No.
go
ahead. Do what you want.
take a step back. So, The JOC conference brought upon the 1982 conference, which led to the 2 years to build NAHA, and you were chairing the committee that put together. So can you tell us about that process? First of all, the selection of the people who drafted the bylaws.
We did it a couple of ways. I mean, the whole point was how big a group and what should they represent. Well, we thought they should represent everything. Spanish language media, Spanish language, and by then there was more Spanish language television, radio. So we wanted to make sure every facet of bicultural was represented, whether it was Latinos in the English language newsroom or of any newsroom of radio, TV, whatever. So that was important. So that's what we did. I mean, I knew I could. I have to think about it, but I knew a lot of people. Frank Newton did a good job of just looking around, outreach, and we'd get together. He'd say, "Well, you know, there's a such and such, who's at the such and such," and we thought about location, where were they from, the media they represented, the whole notion of bilingual or not. So we just reached out, and we got a pretty strong group, I thought, the organizing group, including a lawyer who wrote, made us legal. And we just wanted to make sure every facet of Hispanic journalism was represented.
Was it hard to be to that attempt to be really national, to cover all the bases, the different regions? Was that at any point, were there any challenges?
Yeah. A lot of challenges. And that's when you started to understand there were New York wanted to know why California was so central. Florida wanted to know why New York and California. I mean, Florida and New York, Texas, and every region had regional issues and challenges. And then you realize, I mean, one of the things that I think has happened as we evolved is we also realized every region has, I hate to put it this way, different kind of Hispanics, different blends. I remember it was a long time ago that I was born understanding immigration issues. That was part of my community. My grandmother used to shiver when we go across the border to Tijuana, which we did a lot when I was a kid. But she had her papers to make sure. Well, the people in Florida, the Cubans in Florida, it was in the 90s that a Cuban lawyer said to me, "Now we understand what finally," and it was during that kid that they said, "Well, now we know." I said, it was, by then it was history for us. So a lot of different issues crept out. Discussions, and it used to be. I used to laugh. We'd get. I always used to say we got to be careful at the meetings. You get two Puerto Ricans together, they're going to argue about statehood. You get two Cubans together, they're going to argue about Castro. I mean, it didn't matter, and everybody, and it was fun, but it was also challenging. From that respect, those respects.
So a few minutes back we were talking about the inclusion of other media professions. So was that under discussion at any point? I know that the first NAJ conferences were done, for example, with other organizations from PR and other media enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
How was that? Coming from CCNMA's careful?
It was I remember in Florida we had and see there's a good my career's been all over the place, and I've seen some of these differences. So I was more aware and more prepared, but it didn't matter because in Florida, for example, as Latino entertainment was emerging, they wanted to dominate the program, and we wanted to hear about freedom of speech. We wanted to hear about journalism ethics, and it was to that degree the programs would be difficult. So yeah, it was because all of a sudden the advertising and income generating side of media, in television particularly, wanted to know how come who the hell these journalists were and why were they, well, it was our group, you know? Drawing those lines were difficult. Fortunately, they formed their own groups. That was another offshoot. When you say, I mean, other ethnic groups used our bylaws, and they used our guidance also to form advertising and entertainment groups.
And I had forgotten about asking about this. Um, what about, was there any working relationship with other Latino organizations, NCLR and other?
Recognition, but not working relationships. See, there we get into another issue. At the conference in Washington, I'm going to say it for the record. I think if Dolores Huerta, who's Cesar Chavez's surviving organizer and leader, and a national, she got mad at me because I was holding the microphone for a Q&A with Grassley, Senator Grassley, and she wanted, I can't remember, Grassley and Simpson, they had legislation that was controversial, and she wanted to roast him. Well, once you asked the question, and he had answered, she got mad because I took the microphone away and took the next person. But it was, that's the way journalism works. You got to keep moving. So in that respect, crossing those lines, if we're covering NCLR on political issues or social issues, then we can't be involved, And that was hard for people to recognize sometimes. And that's where we became sellouts or whatever. And that's the way it is. One of the students I remember having a student as an intern at my newspaper one time, and this young lady was all A's in high school, and she had a great internship opportunity at the paper. And she comes to me and says, I gotta quit. I said, why? She says, because you as journalists get involved with people and their stories, and it's a very difficult moment in their lives. Maybe they got arrested, maybe they were attacked, maybe whatever, they had a fire, and then you walk away and go do the next story. See, I can't do that. That's part of the recognition people in a movement or it don't understand. And I understood, and I saved her a lot of agony because she wound up going into religious work. So not everybody understands that. And yes, that's where those conflicts could come up. Because as we started to get involved with those people, or they came to our events, then, the next step, well, what are you going to do? Well, no, we don't do things. We cover them. We don't do things. So it's a good point, but just no resolution to it.
Okay, speaking about this, again, recognition or collaboration, Another institution, and I think it's been central to CCNMA, for example, universities. So I know CCNMA had its office at USC at one point. So going beyond that, what was the collaboration, or what were the links, and what were the boundaries?
What people need to understand and they don't understand. And again, I've been through this a lot. What are the boundaries and what are the links? When monies were more available, and that's been historic. Who funds it? I mean, where do you have an office? Where do you get supplies? Well, the funding is kind of dried up across the board. So schools, even schools, right? Education funding, they expect you to bring money with you. And if you don't bring money with you, can you bring sources that can help fund us? Well, it used to be easy to get that. It's not anymore. The Gannett Foundation was, ask them for I don't know how much, but I'm guessing millions of dollars, one way or the other. They would, like, 200,000 just for forming an NHJ, right there. So and that's Jerry Sass. I mean, he helped make that happen. So funding becomes a big deal. So now we don't have offices. You can answer that question. Nobody provides the support or the funding. And we've had people offer us office space and then want to know how much money we're bringing with us. It's not there. So where does the money come from? That's the question of the day in terms of NHJs. They don't have offices in Washington anymore. They can't. And that was one of my problems. Who's going to pay for it? I would rather have paid for little offices all over the country in somebody's office or whatever than to spend money for headquarters in wherever, across the street from the White House. Why? You know?
So when NAHJ, when the leadership was deciding on where to place the headquarters, there was a short list, right? And there were several offers. I understand Dallas and other places were considered. What was your position at that point?
It was not Washington. In fact, about I want to say 6 years ago, I got a call from an NHJ board member when they realized that office space was an issue. And I shared with them my concern with her. I don't even remember who, but I said, I'd rather have little offices all over than a big office in Washington, because no matter how loud you yell, you're not going to compete with Putin for the president's attention. No, and we shouldn't be. But when the issue comes up, we should be ready to speak. That was my position was. And then the other thing became LA Times, space there. East Coast didn't like that. The same kind of stuff that goes on everywhere came up. So, I hope that answers your question. You understand my position was don't spend a lot of money on that. You're better off spending money on local organizations and chapters and that kind of thing throughout the country. That was my hope.
And we, a couple of minutes ago, we were talking about who's funding and about relationship with Gannett and maybe other industry, other companies. So, was did their support come, for example, did they have any requests? Were they?
Never.
Never?
Not Gannett. And this is my understanding of what happened or didn't happen. And here's an example. Al Newharth, who I talked about, who was kind of the guy who put Gannett on the map, and now Gannett, swallowed up ABC, whatever, right? They're all, Gannett is what it was. But Newharth, one of the things that used to happen, and I believe this is true, rather than get money, they would take shares of Gannett stock for the foundation. Stockpile it, and then over the years that they needed, going to give CCNMA, whatever, then they'd cash in some shares and give us 100,000 or whatever they did, right? That's how the Freedom Forum in Washington was built. Because when Gannett started to, I believe, when Gannett started to step up to on an international level and become part of ABC and all that stuff, right? Who was the biggest shareholder? I believe it was the foundation and Al Newharth. So all of a sudden, go do what you want to do, but fortunately the company had grown. So there's a lot of things that come up when you think about that. So yeah, where'd the money go? I mean, and part of it is the media, the news media companies just, they've become a smaller, well, they've become a smaller group in the big picture in the last 30 years. The good thing about that is there's many more media companies. The bad thing about that is there's many more media companies. You see, there's no big media companies. And even they have taken other groups and become multifaceted companies that do other things. So foundation funding and foundations have a different role and not the kind of monies that are available. It's frustrating.
And well, you mentioned this. There was the incident when I'm going way back now, when the photographer, when this man was he faced discrimination by the authorities, right? By
federal authorities.
Federal authorities.
Well, we don't know. It could have been local police too, but I think it was federal authorities.
And the organization spoke up. So was there anything like that? Any sort of, I don't want to say protest, but maybe any judgment of, for example, of how media themselves, how they handle themselves, their hiring processes, or the context? Was there any that type of?
Yes and no. There's been a lot of situations where we needed to step up, but no, because we haven't been in a financial position to have. I mean, my dream would be to have enough money to pay Jorge Ramos to be our international spokesman. Can't afford that, and he can't afford to give up the spot. So we haven't had the person that. We haven't had a Cesar Chavez for journalism. I wish we had. And that's been one gap. Because, even when it comes up, the notion that we still exist surprises a lot of people in the business, in the media. So we can get their attention for a moment, not demand their attention and not get results. I hate to say it, I'm kind of disappointed in the level to which hiring has not gone on. And you just the other part of it is you don't know. I took I just ran into him recently I saw him at Laverne College, but right there. Luis Valdez, who wrote Zoot Suit. God, there I am with him at his Teatro Campesino in Hollister, and he got the rights had access to the rights to oh God, what's her name? The Mexican artist.
Frida
Yeah,
Kahlo?
he got the rights to Frida. Must have been, well, it's when I was early 90s, I guess. And he had either verbally or committed to doing her story. And he decided there was I don't even know who it was, an Italian actress he wanted to put in the lead role. Man, he got a shitstorm from Latinos. And I saw him the other night, and I said, you don't remember me, but I defended your right to pick whoever you wanted for that role. Because the whole point was he was going to produce and direct it. That's a big deal. About Frida, an international symbol. And all the people in the media, especially television and movies, you can't do that. You can't put an Italian. Well, the whole point of having that kind of authority and control is you get to do it, produce it. So it's like telling me how to write a story. You don't have a right to do that. And I defended him. And he smiled and looked at me and says, I thought I remembered you. And I said, yeah, but my God, you know, the worm turned in a hurry. He says, always happens, always happens. So that kind of thing goes on, whether you're trying to hire somebody or promote somebody as an anchor. I mean, I'm disappointed at the low level of presence we have in the world of anchors around the country. And you look at Good Morning America, at even CBS This Morning. I hate to see it. I hate to say it, but you can see minority faces, but I can't name many Latinos. That's the kind of thing NHJ should have made happen. It's been short for me.
So how, after we kind of stopped, you know, when we were going chronologically, we kind of stopped in the mid-80s. So how was your involvement with both CCNMA and NHA since then?
Well, with CCNMA, I'm always there. I'm a lifetime member. I've supported whatever I could, whenever I could. And I've been involved in countless programs with them. NHJ, not so much. I kind of got shunned because I was interviewed, God, I want to say mid-80s, maybe late 80s. And I was disappointed that we hadn't had a bigger impact and that we hadn't grown more. And it was already starting to turn. The worm had turned and things were getting, you could see the future didn't look that bright. And I said, you know, I'm disappointed. And I made the mistake of saying, it's grown into the national conference, lives off the national conference. I said, it's more like a glorified travel agency. I think I said that. And that everybody got mad. Sorry. But there is a positive aspect to the social side of that people know each other, meet each other, greet each other, and become regular. But there's other stuff that's more serious that needs to be addressed. And it never did a very good job of challenging, hiring, diversity in hiring, I don't think.
Since you've been then more involved with CCNMA, how did both organizations coexist?
With great difficulty. Not because they just had to choose roles. And I tell you, I go back to Frank. Frank's concern about forming a national group, he told me, and I agree, and still agree. I hope it doesn't kill CCNMA. And that's why he wanted me to take the role, and he wanted to know because he didn't want to see CCNMA die. It hasn't died, but it's not what it, you know, neither one is where they could have been. Tough. And it's not just us, it's our supporters. Gannett's role and position has changed. They're bigger, but they're also, it's like ABC, and they own ESPN, and they own, you go on and on and on about the ownership. And in the meantime, the little groups, forgotten, if not, or certainly not the priority we were.
So, and you've mentioned this already, but I was wondering if you could explain, in your view, why is it important to have CCNMA when there is a national organization? So, what would be that added value of CCNMA?
Well, I guess that kind of goes back to what my vision was. My vision was to create such a strong national organization that CCNMA wouldn't be needed. That's never happened. And if it hasn't happened here in California, what about Kansas City or Dallas or Miami or Chicago? And that was my hope, is that we could have the kind of strength throughout the country that we used to have here. That's not quite happened. I don't want to be too negative, but
okay. So as we head into the final stretch of the interview, um, from your experience as executive director and president of CCNMA and your involvement with NAJ, these continue the problem with hiring, for example, with visibility. What in the current media context, what would it take to change that?
I hate to say it. Money, so that we could establish presence and staff in all these places, especially now. For example, Rafael is in North Carolina. I just worked for the census 2010. Look at the numbers for Latinos in North Carolina. There are pockets like that growing all over the country. I understand it, but that doesn't change the opportunity to establish and have a presence. I tell you what I've learned, thanks to Frank Cruz. Frank was an anchor here at the NBC affiliate. He had been drafted. In fact, he was a history teacher when they had the walkouts. You know about that in East LA? And he was kind of the spokesperson for the walkouts. And he was a history teacher. And all of a sudden, NBC said, well, we'll make you a reporter. He became a reporter, then an anchor. But that's the only way they hired a Latino. And Frank, once he got into the business, once he established himself as an anchor, and he was our president, and he once said to us, as we were, what can we do? How are we doing it? He said, and he was convinced, and way before I recognized it, it's not going to happen until we have the money, until we own the station. And I thought, oh my God, are you crazy? He was right. And that's how I said money. If we had the money to establish that kind of presence we've had at a given moment, we could do more. Or support. And you got to pick your spots. How do you do that? I've been very fortunate to have seen, for example, Cal State Northridge has an incredibly strong Chicano studies program. They got 20, 30 faculty. And they have that presence. And they're very well known, but not all over. Cal State Fullerton has a big number in terms of graduating Latinos. But their Chicano studies is a little different. And it's all how you approach and what you do. I mean, we were invited to go to a campus to set up our office at one point. And the first thing they wanted to know was, well, what kind of funding are you going to bring? Well, and while I understand how education's having a tough time these days, at the same time, a university can just, on its own, with a little bit of chance and leverage, start classes in Chicano media and use one of their faculty. If they had 6 or 8 classes, one class, and put a program together, all of a sudden you attract people, and that could bring resources with it. Students support, the community, now maybe business support, because there's many more people with available funds to contribute. But so the university has resources. That's a campus of 38,000 students. You tell me you can't put together 6 or 8 classes over the course of a year or two? You can. But that's not how it's viewed. You got to walk in with a bag of money. No. There has to be opportunities like that somewhere. So the other problem, the other side of this is our numbers. They're finally being recognized, and Latinos are having more and more, especially in California, more impact. So as that continues to grow, hopefully there'll be better recognition. But that's taken time. It was hard to get. It's hard to get anywhere. To get Villaraigosa elected mayor, but it's coming. It's coming. So I think the same thing for the diversity in the media needs to happen. But Frank's point was you got to own it, and I thought that was so far fetched. Then I realized if you owned it, then you get to set the rules and parameters.
Before I stop the recording, is there anything critical or anything you would like to bring up that I haven't asked about? I mean, I know there are many things.
That's a great wrap-up question. No, I mean, I think we covered a lot more than I thought we would. It's been, we're not done. I would say we're not done. There's more to do. And it's really hard. One of the things we have trouble doing is getting people to come back to support. I mean, that was one of the early years. A lot of people put up, if nothing else, their careers by establishing CCNMA. And it's been the foundation for a lot more, as you know, and as this will, I hope, help recognize. I don't think so. What do you think? Anything else?